retro games fans, this is Andy C from Piece of Eight, but welcome to this week's video. Now, week before last, we explored why the Dreamcast failed, and if you watch that video, you'll know that I don't believe the PlayStation 2 alone killed Sega's final console. In fact, by the time Sony's black box arrived on our shelves, Sega had already been fighting an uphill battle against its weird decisions like the Mega CD, the 32X, the Saturn. Every one of those decisions chipping away at consumer confidence and retailer support, and most importantly, Sega's finances. Now, the PS2 might have landed that final punch, but the fight had started years earlier, and there's so much more to that tale, so go watch the video, of course. Now, whenever I finish researching one of these videos in the month with, I always end up asking myself this question: what if? Now, last month we looked at the Amiga, and I couldn't help wondering back then what might have happened if Commodore had made just a few better decisions. Could the Amiga have survived? Could it have challenged Windows PCs into the 90s? Could the gaming landscape have looked completely different in 2026 as a result of that? And this month I found myself asking the same question again, about Sega this time. Now, unlike many failed consoles, the Dreamcast wasn't lacking great games. It wasn't lacking innovation. It certainly wasn't lacking in ambition. That much is too true. If anything, it was perhaps a little too ambitious. So today, I thought we'd have a bit of fun. I am going to rewrite gaming history. But before that, I just want to say a couple of ground rules. This isn't going to be fan fiction. I'm not going to try and claim that Sega suddenly sells 150 million consoles and wipes the floor with Sony, and Sony are a footnote. It's just simply not realistic. Instead, what we're going to do is ask a much more interesting question. What's the smallest change or changes in history that could have completely altered the future of the games industry? Because quite often, history turns on those small moments, those single decisions, those slightly delayed products, that investment arriving at the right time, one publisher maybe changing its mind, one executive taking a different path. Tiny decisions that create enormous consequences years later. Just think about this right for a second. If Sony had never decided to build the original PlayStation, gaming history would look completely different. If Nintendo had accepted Sony's CD partnership, there may never have even been a PlayStation at all. Sometimes entire industries will pivot on moments that seem utterly insignificant at that moment in time. So what if Sega then had been given just one more chance? Not enough to completely defeat Sony or beat them in any way, not enough to even dominate the market per se, just enough to survive, because there's the important distinction, right? So throughout this video, what I'm going to do is not try and imagine a world where Sega wins all of the console worlds. I'm going to wars even. I'm going to imagine a world where Sega simply just stays in the fight. Imagine walking into a game shop in 2005. On one shelf you got the PS2, then you got the Xbox next to it. Nintendo's GameCube is also in there somewhere, and alongside them, a brand new Sega machine. Orange swirl or blue swirl if you're in the PAL region, still proudly sitting on the box. The arcade company that simply refused to quit. What would it have looked like? What games would we be playing on it? And would Xbox have even become the success that it is today? Would Nintendo have taken the same risks? Would online console gaming have evolved much more quickly? Or would Sega simply have just delayed the inevitable? So these are the questions we're going to explore in this video. Not by necessarily completely making things up as we go along, but by trying to perhaps navigate and follow the evidence a little bit. We're going to look at the technology that already existed at the time. We're going to consider the partnerships that Sega had already built, the ideas they were already starting to explore before they exited the console market. And we're going to ask ourselves one simple question at every stage. What would Sega have most likely done next? Because the answer, I think, is more interesting than simply saying Dreamcast 2 would have beaten the PlayStation. Maybe it would, who knows? But yeah, where does our alternate timeline begin then? Well, I think perhaps surprisingly, it doesn't begin with the Dreamcast. It begins with one very small change, one little decision, one opportunity, one moment in time. And that might just have been enough to have saved Sega. So let's go back to 2001 in true in true time travel style. Let's go all the way back 25 years and take a look. Where does our new timeline begin? Well, perhaps not where you'd expect. Now, if we're going to create a believable version, an alternative believable version of history, then we don't need Sega to suddenly become the biggest company in gaming. We don't need the Dreamcast to outsell the PlayStation 2, and we certainly don't need Sony to make a catastrophic mistake. I would be sad. I love my PlayStation 2. In fact, I don't think any of those things would happen anyway, so let's try and keep this as real as we possibly can. Instead, I think Sega only really needed one more thing, and that was more time. Because when the Dreamcast launched in 1999, it wasn't a failure. We've discussed this before, far from it. In North America, in fact, the launch was phenomenal. Sega sold over 500,000 consoles in just 2 weeks, and it was one of the most successful game console launches of all time. The industry had never seen anything like it. Reviewers absolutely loved it, players loved it, and for the first time in some time, retailers were optimistic. It looked at that moment like Sega was back. The problem wasn't demand, the problem was cash. Years of losses from the Saturn era had left Sega in an incredibly fragile financial position. So the Dreamcast wasn't expected to just be successful, it had to be successful immediately. Every single month would matter, every quarter absolutely crucial. There just wasn't enough money left in the business to weather another long fight, and that's where I think our timeline could potentially change. Not with a miracle per se, but with a lifeline. Now, in reality, Sega received significant financial support from Isao Okawa, chairman of CSK and one of Sega's biggest supporters. Towards the end of his life, he personally forgave hundreds of millions of dollars of Sega's debt and transferred shares back to the company, giving it valuable breathing room. But by then, the decision had already been taken to exit the hardware business. So what would have happened then if that support had come perhaps a little bit earlier, say 18 months earlier or even 12 months earlier? Enough to reinsure investors, enough to convince retailers that Sega wasn't about to disappear overnight. It will be enough to buy one more holiday season, because that's really all Sega actually needed. Just one more year, one more chance to prove that online gaming wasn't a gimmick, one more year to show that broadband internet would become more common, one more year for Dreamcast's incredible software library to grow, and one more year, just one more year before people began to write Sega off completely. There's another small change that also could have happened in the shape of Electronic Arts. It's impossible to talk about the Dreamcast without mentioning EA. The relationship between the two companies had completely broken down, largely because Sega wanted to retain control of its own sports franchises, particularly the hugely successful NFL 2K series. EA just didn't like it. They wanted to be in charge of all of the sports games, and so they walked away. So that meant there was no FIFA, no Madden, no NHL, no Need for Speed. And for many games, especially in North America, those weren't just absent games, they were games that sold systems. Now, I'm not necessarily suggesting that EA suddenly becomes Sega's best buddy, but imagine that there was a compromise, a limited publishing agreement where perhaps we saw maybe just FIFA and Madden, enough to remove one of Sega's biggest weaknesses. Would that alone have saved Sega? Probably not. But remember, what we're trying to do here is stack these small changes, not the giant ones. And then there's timing. The PS2 launched with enormous hype, but its first year wasn't exactly perfect. Developers struggled to get the most from its notoriously complex hardware. Many early games looked surprisingly similar to what we'd already seen on the Dreamcast. Some, in fact, were actually arguably worse. And in our timeline, Sega recognises that, and instead of going into panic mode, they double down. They market what they already have. They launch better looking games, arcade perfect conversions, push the online gaming thing, and lower the price. And the message then becomes simple. Why wait for tomorrow when you can play the future of gaming today? It's a bold campaign, and maybe, just maybe, it works. And it's not going to be enough to beat Sony. That ship has already sailed. but enough to keep selling consoles, enough to keep attracting developers, and enough to keep the board at Sega believing that all is not lost. Because surviving isn't about winning every battle, it's about staying alive long enough for the next opportunity. And in our alternate timeline, Sega does just that. Therefore, the Dreamcast survives with that orange/blue swirl living on. The company stays in the hardware business, and suddenly the console war becomes a lot more interesting. Roll forward to 2002. Instead of 3 companies now fighting for your living room, there are now 4. And that changes everything. So by the end of 2001, our timeline has now officially diverged from reality. The Dreamcast hasn't beaten the PlayStation 2. In fact, it's still sitting comfortably behind Sony's machine in terms of sales. But then that was never the point, was it? The point is that Sega is still here. It's still releasing games. It's still supporting its console, and it is still planning for the future. And suddenly, the 6th generation of gaming looks very different indeed. Instead of 3 major players, now we have 4. We've got Sony, we've got Nintendo, we've got Microsoft, and just imagine for a second, we still have Sega. Now, some of you will know that Dreamcast's greatest strength wasn't raw power. It was personality. It was a console that was built by an arcade company. It was fast. It was very colourful. It was immediate. And it wasn't trying to be a multimedia entertainment system. It wasn't trying, I should say, to replace your DVD player. Not that at this point many of us had a DVD player unless we had a PS2. It simply wanted you to have fun. And in our alternate timeline, Sega leans into this identity even harder. So instead of trying to out Sony, they became the anti-PlayStation. Now, while Sony was producing huge cinematic adventures, pushing ever more realistic graphics, Sega will double down on arcade gameplay, pick up and play experiences, local multiplayer, and those innovative ideas it was famous for. Games that are easy to learn, difficult to master, and impossible to put down. Think about what was happening in arcades during that period, right in the early 2000s. Sega was still producing incredible machines. We had House of the Dead, Virtua Tennis, Crazy Taxi, Ferrari F355 Challenge, Outrun 2. They hadn't forgotten how to make games. Some might argue they have now, sadly, but back then they hadn't forgotten how to make games. Far from it. The problem was getting people to play them at home. Now, imagine every one of those experiences arriving on a console whose entire identity is built around bringing the arcade into your living room. It becomes Sega's USP, their unique selling point. And what that means is now there's this clear distinction. Sony owns cinematic gaming, Nintendo owns family gaming, Microsoft owns online shooters, Sega owns the arcade. And suddenly, that, at least to me, doesn't sound like a really bad place to be. But there's another area where Sega had a genuine head start, online gaming. Now remember, the Dreamcast launched with a built-in modem. The PS2 did not and required an online adapter later in its life, which that still amazes me. The fact that the Dreamcast came with online gaming amazes me. In 1999, Sega was effectively betting the ranch on the future of gaming on the internet. Years before Xbox Live, years before PlayStation Network, years before most households even had broadband. In reality, the world simply wasn't quite ready for it yet. But in our timeline, Sega survives just long enough for the rest of the world to catch up. Broadband adoption begins to increase. More homes are permanently connected to the internet. Online gaming really starts to become something that people expect rather than something they occasionally experiment with. And Sega, well, they're already there. They are the trailblazer. They've already built the infrastructure. They've already learned the lessons. They've already released games like Phantasy Star Online that proves that console gaming and console gamers want connected experiences. So probably for the first time since the Sega Mega Drive, Sega isn't following the industry, it's really starting to lead it. Now, there's another interesting consequence to all of this, and that is competition, healthy competition. One of the biggest criticisms leveled at the modern games industry is that consoles have simply become increasingly similar. Really powerful boxes, Similar controllers, very similar online services and experiences, different exclusives maybe, but broadly the same tired philosophy. Now, Sega's never been that company. Look back through their history, the Master System had 3D glasses, which was wild. The Mega Drive embraced speed with attitude. Even the Saturn experimented with twin processors. On the Dreamcast, we had the VMU, and of course that built-in online play, which we've spoken about. Whether or not those ideas succeeded kind of really doesn't matter. The point is that Sega was always a company that wanted to try something different. And that's what the industry gets to keep. Another company that's willing to take those risks. Another company that's going to force Sony, Nintendo and Microsoft to respond. And another company that's asking, well, what if we did things a little bit differently? And that's often where the best ideas, of course, will come from. Not from the market leader, but from the challenger, the underdog. Of course, keeping the Dreamcast alive forever was never going to be realistic. Technology moves very quickly, as we know. Consumers expect something new. So in our timeline, skipping forward to 2004, the Dreamcast is becoming a bit long in the tooth and is showing its age. The PS2 is a phenomenon at this point. The Xbox has started to establish itself. Nintendo is getting ready for its next move. Yeah, that was a big move as well. Sega has reached a crossroads. Do they finally admit defeat at this point? Or do they do what they've always done? Build something completely unexpected? Because if Sega was going to stay in that hardware business, the next console couldn't simply be another Dreamcast. It had to be something much bigger. It had to be Dreamcast 2. It's 2004. Against the odds, Sega has survived in our alternate universe. It's not dominated, it's not conquered the industry, it has just survived. It's hung on. And the Dreamcast has done exactly what it needed to do for Sega. It bought Sega something very, very and utterly priceless. It bought them time. But by now, the writing is, of course, on the wall. The Dreamcast is beginning to show its age, as I said in the last chapter. The PlayStation 2 is a runaway success with over 100 million consoles sold, and Microsoft at this point is now starting to gain momentum with its new Xbox. Nintendo is preparing to unveil what will eventually become the Wii, of course, which was also somewhat of a game changer. So Sega can't just keep asking people to buy yesterday's technology. If they're serious about staying in the console market, in the hardware business, then they're going to need a new console. So what would Sega's Dreamcast 2, or whatever they wanted to call it, actually have looked like? Well, I don't think Sega would have tried to beat Sony or Microsoft on sheer processing power. History tells us that that was never really Sega's style anyway. Instead, I think they'd have asked a different question. What kind of console would only Sega build? Now, the first thing to change would have been the media format. One of the Dreamcast's biggest weaknesses was its use of the GD-ROM. It was clever, it offered more capacity than a standard CD, but it couldn't compete with the DVD. By 2004, DVDs weren't just for films anymore, they were also the standards for games at this point. So Dreamcast 2 would almost certainly have adopted DVD from day one, not because Sega wanted to copy Sony, but because by this point it simply just made sense. Next up would have been broadband, and I don't think this would even be speculation, right? Sega had been talking about broadband since the original Dreamcast. In Japan and North America, broadband adapters already existed. They were quite expensive, admittedly, at this point, and they weren't widely adopted yet, but they proved Sega knew where the future was heading, so that gamble had paid off at this point, to a certain greater or lesser extent. So in our timeline, broadband isn't an optional accessory, it's built in. It's built into every console, every game, and every owner. Just imagine that for a second. In 2004, before Xbox Live had truly found its feet, Sega is shipping every console ready for online play straight out of the box. No add-ons needed, no adapters needed, no compromises. That's it. And then comes the storage. The original Dreamcast relied almost entirely on memory cards, but by 2004, downloadable content, game patches and digital services were becoming increasingly important. Dreamcast 2 would almost certainly include a hard drive. Not necessarily a huge one by today's standards, probably 40 gig, maybe 80 gig, but enough to download arcade games, enough to download demos, updates, and of course, additional content. Now remember, Sega wasn't just an arcade company. They had one of the richest back catalogues in gaming. Imagine browsing a digital Sega arcade store in 2005. It just blows my mind. We would have had Space Harrier, Outrun, Golden Axe, Virtua Fighter, Daytona USA, House of the Dead. All available, and all available online, and all available instantly. Years before digital storefronts became the norm. Then there's the controller. I don't think Sega throws away everything that made the Dreamcast controller unique. I actually quite like the Dreamcast controller. The asymmetrical design probably stays. The analog triggers definitely stay. They were years ahead of the competition. They're absolutely fantastic. But perhaps the biggest evolution comes from the VMU. Now, I'll admit this. I think the VMU is absolutely brilliant. But it was also a little on the ridiculous side. It chewed through batteries. The tiny screen was, really only any good for a handful of games. It never really quite reached its full potential. But the actual idea behind it, well, that was genius. So instead of throwing it away, Sega could maybe evolve it. Perhaps it's got a colour screen now. Maybe it's rechargeable. Maybe it's wireless. Maybe we can get it to display maps, inventory, racing telemetry during gameplay. Or maybe, and this is an idea I really like, maybe it syncs with your PC, allowing you to download content, compare scores, manage your saves online. Again, not because we know Sega would have exactly done this, but because it's entirely consistent with the way Sega always thought. It was always experimenting and innovating, always trying something a bit different. Visually, I don't think the Dreamcast 2 becomes another anonymous black box either. If you look at Sega's hardware over the years, they were never afraid of standing out. The Dreamcast's clean white design became iconic. I'd probably keep that. That white casing, that swirl on the top, orange for NTSC, blue for PAL. Perhaps a little slimmer maybe, a little more modern, but unmistakably Sega. You'd know exactly what it was from the other side of the room. But perhaps the biggest change isn't the hardware at all, it's now the philosophy. Sony is chasing cinematic realism, Sony is building an online entertainment platform, and Nintendo is beginning to rethink how people interact with games completely. Sega, well, they're going to ask one simple question: is it fun? Every design decision starts there. Can you pick it up and enjoy it within minutes? Can friends gather around the TV? Can someone who's never played this game before, can they understand it? Can it deliver that magical feeling people had standing in front of a Sega arcade cabinet in the arcade? Because that's something that there is no other company on the planet that can replicate. Only Sega has that heritage. Only Sega has decades of arcade experience, and only Sega understands that games don't always have to be bigger and more amazing and more cinematic. They just need to be more fun. So would the Dreamcast 2 then have been the most powerful console? Probably not. Almost certainly not. Would it have sold more than the PlayStation 3? Probably not. Again, probably not. But do I think it would have been something that we'd have lost do I believe it would have been something that we've lost a little bit in modern gaming these days? A console with genuine personality, one that wasn't afraid to be different, one that reminded us that innovation isn't always about teraflops and processing power. Sometimes it's about making people smile. And if Dreamcast 2 really had launched in 2005, there's one company that would have been watching very, very carefully indeed. That company is Microsoft. Now, here's a question that doesn't change Sega's future. It potentially changes Microsoft's too, because when people talk about the Dreamcast, there's one fascinating little detail that quite often gets overlooked. The Dreamcast wasn't just built by Sega, it was, well, in part, also built by Microsoft. Some of you may have realised that, some of you may not have done. The console supported Windows CE. It had this compatibility layer, a version of Microsoft's operating system that was designed to make it easier for developers to bring PC games across to the Dreamcast. Now, not every game used it. In fact, many of the Dreamcast's biggest titles ran directly on Sega's own development tools for maximum performance. But, we've seen this before. The partnership was there. Microsoft and Sega already knew each other. And that's really important because while Sega was trying to save the Dreamcast, Microsoft was also trying to answer a very different question, which was, how do we stop Sony from taking over the living room? Something that Bill Gates was utterly terrified about. By the 1990s, by the late 1990s, Windows dominated the PC, but Sony's PlayStation had shown that millions of people were perfectly happy buying a dedicated games console instead of a PC. If Sony continued to grow, then there was a genuine fear inside Microsoft that the living room of the future might belong to somebody else. And that's one of the reasons why the Xbox project itself was born. It wasn't just about games, it was about protecting Microsoft's future. Now, imagine, again, in our alternate timeline, that Sega survives. The Dreamcast continues selling Dreamcast 2. Dreamcast continues selling. Dreamcast 2, is on the horizon. Microsoft suddenly has a choice. Do they spend billions creating an entirely new console from scratch? Or do they strengthen the partnership they've already got? It's a really interesting thought because, after all, the two companies actually had quite complementary strengths. Sega, of course, knows games, new games. Microsoft knows software. Sega had decades of experience designing hardware that players loved. Microsoft had the money, the infrastructure, and one of the biggest software ecosystems on the planet. It's not difficult to imagine a much deeper partnership emerging. Perhaps Microsoft provides the operating system. Perhaps they power Sega's online services. Maybe Xbox Live never even becomes an Xbox Live at all. Maybe it launches as the online service for the Dreamcast 2. Now, it's not as far-fetched as you might think. Companies collaborate on hardware all of the time. Look at the Panasonic 3DO. Panasonic building the 3DO. Philips working with Nintendo before that famous deal collapsed. Even today, AMD supplies both Sony and Microsoft with the technology that powers their consoles. The games industry has always been built on partnerships. So perhaps instead of competing, Microsoft invests. Simple. Maybe they become Sega's strategic technology partner, or perhaps they just buy them. Microsoft had a habit of doing that back in the day. Now, before anyone rushes to the comments, yes, I know that does sound a little bit extreme and a bit dramatic, but remember, Microsoft has never been shy about acquiring gaming companies, or any companies for that matter. In recent years, we've seen them buy Mojang. They picked up Bethesda a while ago, Activision Blizzard. Buying Sega in the early 2000s wouldn't have been that unrealistic, or certainly wouldn't have been impossible, especially if it gave Microsoft an instant foothold in Japan, something Xbox struggled with for years. Can you imagine that announcement? Sega, now powered by Microsoft. The gaming world would have exploded, but let's take it one step further. If Microsoft isn't busy designing its own console, well, what happens to Halo? Does it still launch as Xbox killer app? Or does it become the flagship exclusive for the Dreamcast 2? It's a strange thought, isn't it? Master Chief on a Sega console 25 years later. It almost feels impossible to imagine that world. But alternate history has a really funny way of making the impossible seem surprisingly plausible. Of course, there's another possibility. Microsoft builds the Xbox anyway. After all, they weren't just chasing Sega, they were chasing Sony. Protecting Windows was still a priority. Stopping PlayStation becoming the centre of home entertainment still mattered. So perhaps the Xbox still launches, only now, instead of entering a market where Sega has disappeared, it enters a market where Sega is already established. And suddenly, Microsoft has now got another rival to think about, another online-focused company, another innovator, another business fighting for third-party developers. And instead of this three-way contest, we now have four giants battling for the future of gaming. And I think it's fairly safe to say that that competition is going to change everything, because history tells us something really, really profound. The more companies compete, the more they innovate. Simple as that, which raises a really interesting, fascinating question. If Sega had stayed in the hardware business, what incredible games would we have seen that we may never have seen, that never came to be? Yeah, it's a really interesting thought, isn't it? I honestly think Microsoft would have bought Sega. I think that for me is the most likely outcome, and I don't think we would have ever seen the Xbox. Many people, of course, talk about the Xbox as a spiritual successor to the Dreamcast. So, yeah, that's a really interesting one for sure. Let's indulge ourselves in that question then for a second and ask ourselves, what games would we have got? And honestly, I don't think the answer is simply just more Sonic. Because if Sega had survived as a hardware manufacturer, well, it wouldn't have been about keeping existing franchises alive. I think Sonic exists for that reason because Sega exited. It would have changed the way Sega developed games altogether, because one of the things that made Sega so unique through the 1980s and the 1990s was its connection to the arcade. Unlike Sony or Nintendo, Sega owned and operated arcades all over the world. That meant that they designed games differently. Games had to grab your attention immediately, they had to be exciting within seconds, easy to understand, and to make sure that you kept putting your money in the machine, difficult to master. So whether it was Virtua Fighter, Outrun, Daytona USA, Crazy Taxi, Sega Rally, Virtua Tennis or House of the Dead, Sega understood something incredibly well. And that was that fun didn't need a 2-hour tutorial, it just needed great gameplay. Now, as the industry moved into the mid-2000s, gaming was beginning to change. Budgets were getting bigger, stories were becoming longer, open worlds more and more massive, games were becoming more cinematic, and that was what was expected. So don't get me wrong, some of my favourite games ever came from that era, but there was a trade-off. The quick pick up and play arcade experiences were really starting to slowly disappear. If Sega had still been making consoles, I don't think they would have followed that trend completely. Instead, I think they would have become the home of games you could just simply jump into. The kind of games you would play for 20 minutes, 30 minutes max, and suddenly realise you've been playing then for 3 hours. Imagine where franchises like Crazy Taxi might have gone. The original formula was brilliant. It was fast, it was simple, and it was completely mad and chaotic. But you'd have online leaderboards, downloadable cities, community challenges. It could have evolved into something much bigger. Maybe we're going to see that. Maybe we are going to see that with the reboot of Crazy Taxi. Then there's Jet Set Radio. Even today, it still feels fresh. The art style hasn't changed. The music is unforgettable. The movement is satisfying. In a world where Sega keeps making hardware, perhaps Jet Set Radio becomes one of the defining online multiplayer experiences of the 2000s. Maybe players are creating their own graffiti, sharing custom maps, competing in online street battles, years before user-generated content became commonplace. And then there's Shenmue, perhaps the biggest what-if of all. Yu Suzuki always envisioned Shenmue as an epic, multi-part story. But Sega's financial struggles meant that vision was never truly realised in the way that he'd originally intended. In our timeline, however, perhaps Shenmue continues uninterrupted. Perhaps Ryo Hazuki's story reaches its conclusion years earlier. Maybe it becomes Sega's answer to the big cinematic adventures Sony was beginning to become famous for. And then there's Phantasy Star Online. This one is particularly interesting because Sega wasn't experimenting with online gaming. They were leading it. They were trailblazing. So if Dreamcast had survived, if broadband became standard, if Sega continued investing, who's to say Phantasy Star Online doesn't become one of the biggest online console games in the world? Long before Destiny, long before The Division, long before World of Warcraft even, long before many of today's games, today's online RPGs. Sega was already proving that people wanted connected console experiences, and perhaps that is the biggest loss of all. Not one particular game, but an entire design philosophy. Sega always seemed willing to greenlight these ideas that other publishers just wouldn't touch. Those kind of weird ideas and colourful ideas and experimental innovations. Games that probably shouldn't have worked, but somehow they just did. Think of games, Typing of the Dead, Space Channel 5, Res, Choo Choo Rocket, that's the game I've got. No focus group would ever have approved some of those concepts, yet Sega made them anyway. And sometimes they become huge successes, and sometimes they become cult classics, and sometimes they completely baffle everyone, and sometimes all three. But I'll tell you this much for nothing, they were never boring, even if they made no sense. I sometimes wonder if that's what the industry has lost the most, that company that was willing to take those creative risks, a company that was prepared to launch something completely unexpected, simply because someone had a bizarre and brilliant idea. Because when Sega stopped making consoles, something else happened too. They stopped needing games that sold hardware, and once that pressure disappeared, inevitably some of those bigger, stranger, riskier ideas disappeared too. So would every Dreamcast 2 exclusive have been a masterpiece? Well, no, of course not. Some would almost certainly have failed, and probably knowing Sega, they would have failed spectacularly. But I suspect that they all have had one thing in common. They will have been unmistakably Sega. And I think whilst it's fun to imagine all of those games we never got, I think the real fascinating question is this. If Sega had stayed in the hardware business, well, how would its competitors in the shape of Sony and Nintendo have responded? Because competition doesn't just change one company, it changes everyone. So it is easy to think of the console wars as a race, right? 3 companies all trying to beat each other, maybe 4. But in reality, competition has always been much more than that. Competition forces companies to innovate, it forces them to react, and of course, most importantly, it also forces them to take risks. And sometimes the best ideas don't come from the company that is winning, they come from the company that is playing catch up. So let's go and imagine our alternate timeline once again. It is now the mid-2000s. Sony is unsurprisingly the market leader at this point. Microsoft has established itself as a serious player, and Nintendo is preparing to reinvent gaming with the Wii. But in our alternate timeline, of course, Sega is still there, not dominating the market, but constantly doing things differently. So how is everybody else going to respond to that? Well, let's start with Sony. In reality, Sony could afford to be more comfortable. The PS2 became the best-selling console of all time. It sold over 160 million units. Developers flocked to it. Publishers prioritized it, and it became the default choice for millions of gamers, myself included. But in our timeline, there is another competitor constantly nipping at their heels. Maybe Sony invests more heavily in online gaming earlier. After all, Sega had shown that connecting gaming wasn't just a gimmick. They've de-risked it for Sony. Perhaps Sony's PlayStation Network arrives a little bit sooner. Maybe digital downloads become a priority years before they did. Perhaps even Sony leans into the exclusive games. It leans even harder, into exclusive games to keep Dreamcast owners from switching. Maybe. Now let's look at Nintendo. This one's fascinating because Nintendo has also always done its own thing. When Sony and Microsoft chased processing power, Nintendo gave us the motion controls. That is something that Sega might have done. When everybody else pursued realism, Sega doubled down on fun. Sound familiar? Yes. In many ways, Sega and Nintendo are actually more alike than people often remember. Both companies were prepared to innovate and experiment and take a risk. Both believed that gameplay came first, for sure. Both were willing to build strange hardware if they thought it would make games more enjoyable. Would the Wii still have happened? Yeah, I think the Wii would have still happened. But perhaps Sega's continued presence encourages Nintendo to push even further. After all, if another company is constantly producing quirky, innovative hardware, well, you can't afford to stand still. Then there's Microsoft. Obviously, we've touched a little bit on Microsoft already, but if they launch the Xbox into a market that still contains Sega, perhaps they don't become so heavily focused on shooters. Maybe they invest more in Japanese studios much earlier. One of the biggest Xbox weaknesses was its lack of success in Japan. It just never got any traction there, no matter how hard they tried. Sega remaining in hardware only really makes that challenge harder and greater for Microsoft. So perhaps they respond by buying Japanese developers sooner. Perhaps Game Pass or something very similar arrives much earlier as a way of differentiating themselves. Because If there's one thing that history teaches us, it's this, and that is, as I've said, competition accelerates innovation. Every time one company does something clever, the others have to react. Let's think about today, right? Sony introduced trophies, Microsoft expanded achievements, Nintendo eventually embraced online subscription, Sony improved backwards compatibility, Microsoft leaned heavily into it. One idea inspires another. The whole industry moves forward then together, and then there's one final area where I think Sega's survival could have a huge impact, and that is independent developers. Now, this might sound like an odd connection, but hear me out. The Dreamcast already had a reputation for embracing unusual ideas, smaller projects, creative risks, arcade-style experiments, arcade-style experiences. Exactly the sort of games that exploded during the indie revolution a few years later. Now imagine if Sega had recognised that movement earlier. Imagine a Dreamcast digital marketplace built around independent developers in 2006 or 7. Years before Xbox Live Arcade became a major success, years before PlayStation embraced downloadable indie titles, could Sega have become the home of independent games? Honestly, yeah, I think it's possible. They already had the right mindset. They already had valued creativity over spectacle. They already had an audience that was prepared to try something a little bit different. And suddenly, our alternate timeline doesn't just change Sega, it changes how games are made. It changes how they're sold. It changes who gets to make them and which ideas succeed. Really getting into the butterfly effect here, that spreads much further than anyone could have imagined, because here's the thing, right? We've been very optimistic so far, maybe a little bit too optimistic, ever the optimist. History has a habit of reminding us that surviving one battle doesn't mean you've won the war. So before we get too carried away imagining a world where Sega is still making consoles today, we need to ask one final, very important question. And that is, could any of this actually have happened? Could any of this actually have happened? I'll see you in the next section. We've imagined a world where the Dreamcast lives on, where Dreamcast 2 arrives, where Sega continues to innovate, and where the console wars become a four-way battle. And it's a fun idea. It's a nice thought to have. And I think, in reality, I don't think it's that unbelievable. I think it is a believable one. But before we disappear completely into our alternate fringe style timeline, we do need a bit of a reality check, because even if every one of the changes we've talked about today happened, well, Sega still had some pretty big problems that they needed to overcome. And let's start with the really obvious one, the elephant in the room, money. Even in our new timeline, Sega isn't suddenly swimming in cash. The Dreamcast buys them breathing room, if nothing else. It doesn't magically erase years of financial losses. Developing consoles has always been an incredibly expensive business. There's huge research and development costs. There's tooling up for manufacturing. You've got to market it, which is an expensive business. You've got to get developer support. You've got to build your online infrastructure. If you're building a console today, every new generation costs billions and billions to produce. Sony could certainly afford that. Nintendo had decades of financial stability behind it, and Microsoft, well, they have very deep pockets. They can certainly afford it. Sega, on the other hand, well, they didn't. Every new console generation would always have been a huge gamble for them. Then there is the software support. So earlier we imagined Electronic Arts signed some kind of compromise agreement. That would certainly help. That much is true. But EA wasn't the only publisher whose support really mattered. The early 2000s saw development budgets begin to explode. Publishers would naturally start focusing on the biggest install bases. And that's where Sega would still have struggled. Even if the Dreamcast sold another 5 to 10 million consoles, would Rockstar suddenly have abandoned the PlayStation? Probably not. Would Grand Theft Auto have even run on a Dreamcast? Who knows? Would Square Enix move Final Fantasy to Sega? Well, almost certainly not. Would Activision prioritise Dreamcast over Xbox? Again, I would say that's pretty unlikely. Sega would still have needed to fight for every major third-party release, and perhaps the biggest challenge of all, well, we saw it in Amiga with Commodore with Amiga, is management. Now, this is something we've touched on through our Dreamcast month. Sega wasn't just battling Sony, it was quite often battling itself. It was well known throughout the 1990s there were frequent disagreements between Sega of Japan and Sega of America. They both had different priorities, they both had different strategies, they both had different visions for the future. It's why the Saturn was such a mess. Sometimes those disagreements produced great ideas, but more often than not, in fact, they slowed decision making down and created huge amounts of confusion. Now, if those internal issues weren't addressed, it's entirely possible. It's entirely possible that history would just simply repeat itself. We'd have another brilliant console, another difficult generation, another financial crisis, because that great hardware isn't automatically going to fix organisational problems. As I've just said, ask Commodore. There's our Amiga comparison again. The Amiga was technically outstanding. The Dreamcast was technically outstanding. Neither company failed because they couldn't build brilliant machines. They both failed because a successful technology business requires much more than just brilliant engineers. It requires consistent leadership, financial discipline, important strategic, strong partnerships, and of course, a coherent long-term strategy. Those are the things that ultimately determine whether a company survives. So, honestly, would Sega still be making consoles in 2026? I don't know. I mean, I don't think anyone can really answer that with any degree of confidence. Maybe the Dreamcast 2 arrives. Maybe the Dreamcast 2 succeeds. Maybe it becomes a cult favourite. Maybe Sega continues as a smaller but respected fourth manufacturer, much like Nintendo carved out its own identity during the Wii era. Or perhaps the rising costs of HD development eventually catch up with them anyway. Maybe they leave the hardware business in 2012 instead of 2001. Maybe they transition into software after one final generation. That's entirely possible too. But here's the thing. I don't actually think that's the most interesting question anymore. Because after spending a month, almost a month now, with revisiting the Dreamcast, one thing I've realised that whether Sega survived isn't the point. The point is that they could have. Yeah, the gap between the world we got and the world we might have had was much smaller than I kind of had ever really appreciated. History wasn't decided because the Dreamcast was a bad console. It was decided by finances and by timing and by business decisions and a handful of missed opportunities. And that's what makes the Dreamcast story so interesting and fascinating. It isn't inevitable. It's fragile. Change just a few moments, and gaming history really starts to look very different indeed. Which brings us to one final question, and thanks for watching so far. If Sega really had survived, well, what would they be building today? Let's indulge ourselves for just a few more minutes. So, we've brought Sega through the early 2000s, right? They've survived the Dreamcast, they've released a successful successor, and they found their place alongside Sony, Microsoft and Nintendo. The orange/blue swirl is still very much alive, which brings us to today. It's 2026. What does a Sega console actually look like in this alternate reality? Well, I don't think it looks anything like a PlayStation or an Xbox for that matter, and I certainly don't think Sega would be trying to win the teraflop race, because that's never really been who they were. If there's one thing we've learned throughout this Dreamcast month so far, it's that Sega has always had its own identity. The Master System challenged Nintendo by doing things a bit differently. The Nintendo was challenged by the Mega Drive by being faster, louder and cooler. And the Saturn itself as well was technically fascinating, even if it was really difficult to develop for. And of course the Dreamcast was experimenting with online gaming years before people even knew they wanted it. Every Sega console asked a slightly different question, which was, what haven't we tried yet? What haven't we done yet? And I think that philosophy would probably still live today, existing in 2026. So rather than building the most powerful console, Sega builds the most interesting one. Imagine opening the box, and instead of another anonymous black rectangle, you see a sleek white console with clean lines, a glowing swirl, very minimalist, very modern, but instantly recognizable as Sega. You know it's a Sega machine before you've even plugged it in. The controller continues that philosophy. It's comfortable. Its beauty is in its simplicity, but with one or two ideas that make you stop, maybe raise an eyebrow, maybe make a wry smile. Maybe adaptive analog triggers evolved from the Dreamcast's originals. Maybe small programmable displays inspired by the VMU make a return. Not because they're essential, not at all, but because they're unmistakably Sega. Perhaps your phone becomes the modern VMU, showing maps and managing inventory and displaying achievements, connecting friends. Not as a gimmick, but as an evolution of an idea that Sega had all the way back in 1999. And then, of course, there's the dashboard. The moment you switch it on, no walls of advertising, no endless menus, just games, bright colours, arcade music, and instant access. And within seconds, you're playing. Because Sega always understood something that sometimes I think gets forgotten today. The shortest distance between turning on your console and having fun. And that is usually the best one. I think the online service too would have been pretty fascinating. I mean, we know that Sony has PlayStation Plus and Sony has Game Pass, Nintendo has Switch Online. So what does Sega do? Well, they don't copy them, that much is certainly true. Instead, imagine a service that's built around Sega's greatest strength, its history. Every arcade classic, every Master System game, every Mega Drive title, Saturn, Dreamcast, all from day one. Not hidden away, but there, front and centre, and celebrated. Then you can also add modern online game leaderboards, developer documentaries, museum features, the ability to compare your Daytona USA lap time with someone in Japan, for instance, or maybe your Crazy Taxi high score with someone in Brazil. Not just preserving Sega's history, but making it feel alive and kicking. And perhaps that's where Sega's reality really stands apart. It's all about the community. They always inspired incredibly passionate fans. And you only need to see that by looking at the Dreamcast community today. People are still developing new games for it. They're still reverse engineering hardware. They're still creating online servers decades after official support long since finished. So imagine Sega embracing that enthusiasm, and instead of simply watching from the sidelines, official tools for independent developers, community game jams, digital publishing that's genuinely open to smaller creators, a console where the next great Sega game doesn't necessarily come from a huge studio. It comes from a talented team with a brilliant idea. But because if this alternate reality, I should say, has taught us anything, it's that Sega has always been at its best when it backs creativity over normal convention. And yeah, would it outsell a PlayStation? Probably not. Would it beat Xbox in North America? Almost certainly not. But do I think it would have done something arguably significantly more important? Then yes, it would have delivered a genuine alternative, a console with personality, a console with confidence, and something that was trying to not be something everybody else was. And maybe that's exactly what the industry needs, especially at the moment. Because when every company begins moving in the same direction, sometimes all you need is just one different idea to take the whole industry forward again. And that leaves us with one final question. After everything we've imagined today, what did we actually lose when Sega stopped making consoles? Let's have a look in my final chapter. So, after everything we've imagined today, after rewriting 25 years of gaming history, after saving the Dreamcast, we built a Dreamcast 2, we kept the Sega in the console business. And we've also imagined what a 2026 Sega console could even look like. what have we actually learned? Well, perhaps the biggest surprise for me is this. This video was never really about the Dreamcast. It was about the art of the possible. What could have been? What was the possibility? And that's because if there's one thing that this month has reminded me, it's that gaming history is not inevitable. It's easy to look back with that hindsight and assume events unfolded exactly as they were supposed to. That Sega was always destined to lead the hardware business, that Sony was always destined to dominate, and that Microsoft was always going to enter the console market. But of course we know that history doesn't really work like that. History is messy and it's unpredictable. It's shaped by hundreds of tiny little micro decisions that seemed insignificant at the time. A delayed launch, a cancelled partnership, a boardroom meeting, an investor. One publisher choosing to support or not support a particular console. Little moments like that ripple across decades. We've said it a couple of times in this video already. Last month we were looking at the Amiga. We reached a very similar conclusion. The Amiga wasn't held back because of the technology not being good enough. In many ways it was years ahead of its rivals. It was held back by business decisions, poor leadership, a lack of long-term direction, and in many respects our humble Dreamcast tells exactly the same story. Not a failure of imagination or even a failure of execution, because when you actually look at what Sega built, the Dreamcast was extraordinary. It built in online gaming. We had the VMU, the arcade perfect conversions, groundbreaking games like Shenmue, Phantasy Star Online, Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, features and ideas in a console that would become standard, just expected years later. This wasn't then a company that was running out of ideas. If anything, they had too many, and you know, as we saw in the earlier 90s, some of those crazy ideas actually became part of their undoing. And maybe that's why the Dreamcast has become such a beloved console, because people don't remember it for selling the most, because it didn't, and people don't remember it because it was the most powerful, because it wasn't. People remember it because it represented something a little bit more ethereal, which is optimism and creativity and experimentation and that willingness to do something completely different and break the mold. And when Sega left the hardware business, the industry didn't just lose another console manufacturer, it lost a complete way of thinking, because competition is not just about market share. Nintendo have shown that. They've always challenged the industry in their own way. It's about ideas. Sony changed how we thought about cinematic gaming as well. Microsoft transformed online services and digital ecosystems. Sega reminded us that games should surprise you. They should make you smile. They should be enjoyable. They remind us that taking risks is sometimes more important than playing it safe. Now, don't get me wrong, right? We've had some incredible consoles since the Dreamcast disappeared. We had the Xbox 360, we've had the Wii, the PS4, the Nintendo Switch. And gaming has continued to evolve in some really wonderful ways. But I do sometimes wonder, which is why I made this video, how many brilliant ideas never happened because Sega wasn't there to challenge everybody else. How many strange peripherals might we have seen? How many bold arcade experiences might we have had? How many wonderfully weird games would we have gotten? We'll never know. And perhaps that's the real what if. Not if Sega had won, because I don't think they ever would have. Sony was simply too big. Microsoft had deep pockets. And Nintendo, of course, has some of the strongest brands in entertainment. Winning the console war was never gonna be the realistic outcome. But surviving, building another console, continuing to innovate, I honestly think that was possible. And if nothing else, because it's been a long video, and thank you so much for anybody who's left still watching this, I hope this video has shown just how close that possibility really actually was. Maybe the Dreamcast wasn't the end of Sega's story. Maybe it was simply the ending we happened to get, because in another timeline, somewhere out there, perhaps there's a family sitting in front of their television right now, a white console glowing softly beneath it, an orange swirl lighting up the room, a new Crazy Taxi has launched, a new Jet Set Radio is topping the charts. Shenmue finally reaching its conclusion years ago, and someone is arguing on the internet that Sega's latest console is better than the PlayStation. Now, wouldn't that have been something? Right, okay, like I say, thank you all for watching. I'm just going to pop across now and give you my final thoughts. Yeah, then we'll wrap up for the day because it has been a long one. And so I will see you in my final section. Right, okay, final thoughts, and I will keep this brief because this has been a long old video, and I'm very conscious that everyone's been sticking around, and there was just so much that I wanted to say because it is a really interesting what if, and there are a lot of what ifs in the industry, but for me this is one of those where I often think, you know, wouldn't it be great if Sega had stuck around? Wouldn't it have been good if, yeah, it would be good if Sega came back. You know, what if they decided one day, you know, as part of this sort of reboot philosophy that they've got going on at the moment, maybe they'll just think to themselves, perhaps it's time we got back in the console market. Maybe. Especially in this day and age of digital gaming, maybe there's an opportunity here with Sony's recent announcement about the removal of physical media. You know, maybe there's an opportunity to kind of muscle their way in. Who knows? Maybe. We can but hope. So yes, I hope you enjoyed that. I really enjoyed doing that video. I really enjoyed doing the research and having a good old think about it. And it's been on my mind for a little while. So I hope you enjoyed it. Apologies it was so long. I just couldn't cram it into any less space to still say what I wanted to talk about. So next week we will be looking at 10 of the most surprising things about the Dreamcast. That will be our last sort of feature video before we get to the month with review. And we will also be continuing with the month with for just one more week. I haven't decided what the final video is going to be. There's so many I could choose from. So I'm not quite sure which one I'm going to pick yet. But yeah, there will be something, so stick with me. Thanks all for watching. Thanks for sticking along for the ride if you're still watching. Please do hit that like and subscribe button if you haven't done already. Thank you so much for your support. Really, really do appreciate it. Thank you so much. Hit the bell icon as well for any notifications so you don't miss any content in the future. Just leaves me to say now, thank you again. Please do all take care of yourselves, and I will see you in the next one. Until then, bye for now.